So what we've done here now is we've got these folks that came from far and wide, from UBC, from Port McNeil, all the way up in the north end of Vancouver Island. So this is your opportunity to ask questions, and we're hoping that questions will focus more on what can we on Hornby Island do to further the marine objectives of the herring and all the creatures around us, marine protection. We've heard a lot about these animals. I think we've all got a lot more questions about the animals themselves, but let's see if we can kind of try to focus on asking these people who really are experts in these fields about where can we go from here. So to instill, sort of get the question started, we've asked each one of them to sort of give us a question, to start it with a question or an observation that they think we might think on that you can then respond to us. So if that makes sense, what I'm going to do is try to, as the narrator, I'm going to try to focus this thing, and I don't know whether that's going to work or not. I have no idea whether I'm going to be able to do that, or whether you'll let me do it or they'll let me do it, but that doesn't really matter. Whatever comes out of this will be interesting. So with that, John, could you go first?
I don't know if my voice is working.
No, we have a mic here. Well, that mic going to conflict with this one?
I hope not.
Oh,
All right.
how are we? Okay, sorry, my voice is on its last legs.
Can you
here.
hear back there? Yes. Okay, good.
So, in terms of a question, I guess I was thinking, one thing I didn't really complete in my talk, and it may be of local relevance here in terms of concerns about the herring fishery, which I'm hearing far and wide that there's a lot of discomfort with the level of fishing that appears to be going on, and perhaps a lot of a feeling of uncertainty that this is not pulling the bottom shelves out of the whole trophic, the web. And I guess my question is, I've been dealing in recent months, in the last couple of years in particular, with the concern about southern resident killer whales, which are sort of at the crisis levels here, and Andrew has as well. We've been working a lot with salmon managers and other scientists in other areas to try and figure out what the problem is, and it boils down to food supply, and that there are other complicating or confounding issues such as noise and the effect of noise in catching fish, through masking of echolocation and so on. And the question that I think everybody now agrees that there are obvious and clear signs of nutritional stress in the population. We know there are Chinook salmon specialists with a smattering of other species on the side, but Chinook's what it's all about. And so often what boils down to, this isn't really turning into a question, more of a comment, I guess, is a lot of the question that comes up, okay, they need more Chinook, so how do we make more Chinook? Washington State has just said, well, we're going to make a bunch of hatcheries and crank out hatchery-raised Chinook. The other options are reducing human fisheries in key foraging locations, perhaps. Maybe that might be the easiest management tool, or do we need to cut back coast-wide or through the whole range of Chinook in the Northeast Pacific to allow, because these are highly migratory fish. But what I haven't seen yet, and perhaps this is at the basis of the whole discussion today about the importance of herring, is can we make more Chinook by reducing impacts on Chinook food, i.e. herring, sandlands, other species like this. And I don't think that question has really come up, has it, Andrew? Or is the extraction of herring through the fisheries we see here having an impact up the various trophic levels to Chinook salmon? And if in poor years of Chinook abundance, and the salmon manager is saying, well, it's poor ocean survival. Well, what's causing the poor ocean survival? Well, it would seem to me that it's lack of food for Chinook. So I guess the question that I have, and I'm not sure it's one that's easily answered, but we can certainly talk about it, is it precautionary to be doing this kind of fishery when we don't know what that black box is called ocean survival. And there was a comment earlier about all the anchovies appearing in Owl Sound that Andrew could perhaps talk about, but the local Chinook are having a field day and they're fat and happy. It may be something as simple as that they're not getting enough food, just like the whales aren't getting enough food, but the Chinook aren't either. So I guess a concern of mine, more than a question, is that I don't have a high level of confidence that those ecosystem connections are fully taken into account in management of these fisheries, not just vis-a-vis Chinook and killer whales, but all herring fisheries. You know, these other consumers like humpbacks were a non-issue in the ecosystem 20, 30 years ago, and sea lions really weren't either, and harbor seals were minor. It's a whole new paradigm with all these mammals out there now, and I think it's sort of caught some of the fisheries managers off guard, and that maybe they're not fully taking into account the needs of these animals or the top-down impacts that they're having on the numbers of fish that they're modeling and so on. Anyway, a bit of a ramble, sorry about that. So what was the question?
That was what you were supposed to do.
What is it? What? Dale?
Well, that was good. That'll trigger some reaction from the crowd. Sure.
One way to focus that from a question point of view could be, we've just had the recent, at least to my knowledge, recent closure of the Midcoast, North Island Midcoast herring fishery quite suddenly. And it appears, at least from the news report, that a fair amount of that came from pressure, political pressure, not science necessarily, political pressure. I guess the question I would have is, on that startling chart you showed where all the different areas have been closed with just this one area here left open, have all those closures happened as a result of local political pressure or good science or some mix of the two? And if so, then we here should be thinking about the political pressure we can exert that needs to be done in addition to the science. So could you comment on the level of science that affected those closures, or whether it was largely political?
I can certainly turn this over, Dale, to somebody who might be able to address that, but I don't think I can. But you, Grant, it's your stick.
Can I comment?
Well, yeah, Mike, for sure. Hold on a second here. My fear on that question is if we wait for good science, and you hear these people put their lives into this science, and to get good science and the complexity of science, if we wait for good science that comes out and it's looked at all the problems, all the issues, we wait for that. My worry, that is not a precautionary approach. Because if we wait for the science, my fear is the animals simply won't be here. So the short answer, and the Central Coast, I actually work for a First Nation up there, and it's political. It's First Nations pressure and it's political. It's not the science up there. The populations of the herring up there have gotten low enough that the Heiltsuk and the Kitasoo and the other First Nations have simply, and they've been pressuring disclosure for years and years. Finally, DFO said it simply isn't worth it. So I think it was political pressure more than science, but hopefully science is in the background supporting that. So Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, can you give Mike
The mic. I'm a fishery biologist, retired. I've lived on Denman for 30 years. I've never studied herring myself, but I've been fascinated by the herring spawn as long as I've been on Denman, which is 30 years now. And I pay some attention to the science, such as it is. And there were just, I love the work that Conservancy Hornby Island is doing. I think it's quite proper to be concerned about the herring here. And it's very, very easy to dislike the roe herring fisheries. There's a lot to criticize about it. My view, based on the best available science for what it's worth, is that the roe herring fishery in the Strait of Georgia is not causing conservation concerns for the principal stock that spawns here. I'm not a fan of saying the best available data gives you the absolute best picture of the world forever, but it is the best available data. So let's understand that and critique it. I love the message that we got from both John and Andrew's presentation is ecosystems are not simple, they're not static, they're dynamic. There's always more to them than meets the eye. So a couple of points, I don't want to insert myself into the panel, but there were a few things that I wanted to say that I think are frequently missing from the conversation that we, who maybe consider ourselves principally conservationists, activists, what we get concerned about may not be the principal concerns biologically. So I noticed that one of the objectives of Conservancy Hornby is to end the roe herring fishery. As I say, there's lots that I don't like about it. In terms of herring conservation, I don't think it's a problem right now. As far as we can see, the migratory herring stock that makes up the bulk of the spawning throughout the Strait of Georgia, most of the fish that are here now are probably at or above historic levels right now. There are 5 management units that DFO recognizes in herring that are more or less discrete populations that fluctuate more or less independently and are managed separately. 2 of them have not been fished for several years now because DFO and everyone concerned considers that the populations are too low. That's Haida Gwaii and West Coast Vancouver Island. Reasons for that are not entirely clear. That could be a long conversation. Central Coast and Prince Rupert District, DFO in their monitoring, analysis, and modeling considers that there's room for a conservative, very conservative roe harvest, along with other harvests. Food, social, and ceremonial harvest, Aboriginal commercial in the Central Coast, as well as roe herring. The Central Coast closure of the roe herring fishery this year, in spite of the fact that DFO scientists were recommending a small harvest, is a result of negotiations and political pressure and consultation with the Central Coast First Nations people, principally from Bella Bella. And it's largely a political decision, totally defensible, I think, more power to them. Right here, the principal stock, as far as we can tell from the data that we have, and it's not nothing, the data, the analysis, the modeling from DFO. As far as we can tell, that population is doing fine. DFO is restricting total harvest in that to 20% a year, which as harvest rates on herring family populations go around the world is quite low, very conservative. DFO considers that a precautionary level. It's arguable. You may not think so. DFO inevitably pays attention to the large productive stocks that support fisheries, whether it's salmon or herring, and that leads to problems, particularly for small and less productive stocks. DFO is acknowledging now that, as Grant was talking about, and local people, lots of places will say, there are resident stocks, they're not the same as this big migratory stock. DFO doesn't know much about them, acknowledges that they're there. They must be important. They certainly are important to local people. They probably are important to local fish. It's important to consider local knowledge on those stocks. It's important to learn more about them. DFO doesn't know much about them right now because they don't support commercial fishery. They're not heavily fished, but they may have been driven down initially by the reduction fishery. And then that's another aspect of this one. Okay.
Mike, I want to respond to you. I mean, hey, can you hear me all right? This mic. This mic?
Yeah.
Okay. Mike, I understand that, we've had that conversation before. I mean,
Yeah.
the problem I have is that of the 6 major stocks on the BC coast, 5 of them are basically either completely shut down or very close to it. That doesn't tell me much very good about DFO's precautionary management regime, Mike. I'm afraid that's my problem. My second problem is we had Doug Hay come here and speak, and we asked him a lot of fairly pointed questions, and his answer on 6 or 7 times was, we just don't know. That means precaution says we don't do it until. So we've gone the other way. I think the precaution is the precaution on the side of economics and the license and the fishing people, not on the side of the fish. So Mike, I get your point, but I'm afraid I'm from Missouri on that one. Thank you.
I didn't expect you to accept it, but I want to put it on the
No,
table
that's
to
good.
make
That's
sure
good.
that
No, we
people consider it.
appreciate that, Mike. Thank you.
So I want to talk about the same theme, so maybe we'll come back to your 2 questions and points as well. But I've been thinking, since I've arrived here, I've understood, one of the goals is to stop the road fishing. And as I thought about the justification, the facts that I know it are just what Mike told you. And so I don't see that there's a ground based on saying, our sea lions are in trouble, our harpers are in trouble, other things, or even trying to make the link through to feeding Chinook to feeding southern resident killer whales. But I think there's still a case to be made. And I think I would agree to focus on, so what is unique about your island and about the herring population here? And I would focus on the fact that you've got the most predictable spawning stock. That's unique. Wildlife depend on it. And I think a case can be made to preserving some, treat it as a protected area. And it could almost, on the science side, we could look at it as being our control. In science, we need controls. We want to see what happens to a population that is not fished. We could do studies. Maybe some of the fish here are part of the resident population. But I would try building a different case for what is unique and looking to the future. Think of it, this is going to be the herring trust account. And it's going to give us interest forever. We need to have some areas, and I don't think it works if we're going to shut down all the Salish Sea. But I think we can make a strong case for why some areas are very important for wildlife and what is so unique. And I would focus on this dependency of this area and how science would benefit, as well as the wildlife that comes here.
Could we maybe hear from
Wait. Mary Ann, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, pass the mic.
I had something in my head and I just got it blown away.
It'll boomerang back.
I wanted to touch on when Grant was asking us to come up with our own questions. I was thinking about the slide that Grant showed at the beginning of the day, which showed the planning region to the north of us here, and then the MPA, which is also in planning stages to the south. And what did you call it? The donut hole, I think? Yeah. So I did want to just do a quick overview of some of the planning, marine planning and marine protection processes that are ongoing. And so to the north of us here, stretching up from Johnson Strait all the way to Prince Rupert and out to Haida Gwaii is called the Northern Shelf Bioregion. And a process has gone on in that region called the Marine Planning Partnership. And that was a collaboration between First Nations governments in that area, the provincial government, and stakeholders, including industry and other marine users. And together they came up with plans called the Marine Plans for that area, which put lines and zones on the map for different uses that they decided were going to be happening in those different areas. So what you saw on the map that Grant showed earlier was the zoning map for the northern Vancouver Island region, which has zones for protection management zones, special management zones, and general use zones. And since those plans were completed a few years ago, they've been working towards implementing them. additionally, at the same time, in that same Northern Shelf bioregion area, there's a process that's ongoing with the provincial government, First Nations, and the federal government to design a network of marine protected areas for that region. And then to the south of us here was the map of the Southern Strait of Georgia National Marine Conservation Area, which is not designated as a marine protected area currently. National Marine Conservation Areas are run by Parks Canada, and that area has been in planning process since 2003 without any progress so far. So, additionally, federally and across Canada, there is a concurrent process that the federal government is committed to protecting 10% of our oceans and coasts by 2020. And to do so, the government is working on amending a few of our marine protection laws, which will help them to achieve this goal of achieving 10% protection in the next few years. First among these is our Oceans Act, which is our primary act for marine protected areas, and that is currently under amendment. We have several recommendations for what we think should be in that act, and we brought along a little info sheet, which is out in front if anybody wants to see. And among some of our recommendations for these are including minimum protection standards for marine protected areas, which means that when a marine protected area is designated, that it comes along with a baseline of protection. And currently, Canada's marine protected areas don't have these baseline protections in them. And these would include things like bottom trawling, aquaculture, and bottom sea mining. And second among these, you might have heard that Canada's Fisheries Act is also up for amendment. Several suggested amendments just came out last month. And among these is a new provision that would help to give fisheries closures designated as marine biodiversity conservation areas. So these would be fisheries closures, but with longer term and wider conservation goals. So given all these new tools that are not here yet, and the marine planning processes, coming back to a marine protected area for herring, I think it's important that we consider herring and marine protected areas within a broader scope of marine planning, and especially for species like herring, you need to consider the connections between the different areas that you're considering for protection. So yes, we put a marine protected area here around Hornby. This is where they spawn, but another image that Grant showed this morning showed that they have feeding areas which are offshore of Vancouver Island and also to the north. So if you don't have protection in place there in important feeding habitats, it's not helpful for when they're coming around and all the other interactions that they might have coming through the strait.
Thank you. So there's a few questions lingering on the earlier topic. I was going to hold off the marine protection for a little while yet and figure out, so Tony.
Yeah, just a little bit echoing what you were saying, Grant, in response to what Mike, I'm not a biologist, but I've been trying to look at all the different studies that have been done, and what strikes me is the known unknowns. There are a lot of known unknowns, and they're actually admitted to in the integrated fisheries management plan for herring. You know, DFO admits that, and you know, to me, given the importance of herring to so many species, and the fact we've got what seems like a residual, you know, it's abundant here, but it's a residual abundance that doesn't exist elsewhere. It's something really precious to protect. And I was talking to Dr. Bryony Penn this morning, who's been doing a lot of research on herring. She said, we've lost our herring around Salt Spring. We've got it here, we need to hold on to it. And so I'd like, you know, we're moving to marine protected areas, but what we've got here south of, on the southern end of Hornby is essentially a nascent marine protected area. Anna Zielinski was here earlier. Years ago in the early 90s, she was instrumental in movement getting BC Parks to establish a marine component to Helliwell Park, which is quite large. And it's zoned in our official community plan as a marine protected area. And also, Comox First Nation have identified that as a potential tribal park. So different levels of government, that's already acknowledged. And so that would seem to be one basis for us to move forward locally. And I'd be interested to hear what the panel would think if, you know, just looking at what we can do locally, because it's really hard for us on that little island to look at way beyond our shores. is that something that's worthwhile putting effort into as just being an integral, what do you call it? I'm nervous. A small step towards contributing to bigger protection. And I know in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan there is provision for areas to be excluded from the fishery, so it seems there's like a lot of basis to do that. Is that something that's worthwhile us doing? The other initiative that we're involved in the Islands Trustable Wildlife Fund is setting up an ecological forum for Bain Sound and Lambert Channel, bringing together all the different interests, and Conservancy Hornby Island is part of that planning process. So that might be a stepping stone to look at bringing all the interests together and seeing what potential actions might come out of that, because no one party can really move along on their own. You've always got to find partners, so maybe there's some partnership. So I would just like to hear whether you think it's worth our while putting effort into creating a marine protected area around part of this island, given all the values here. Would that contribute to the well-being of our oceans in the larger picture?
Thanks, Tony.
So I think part of the answer to your question depends on your comfort zone for how much protection and what it is that you're protecting. So it's just a herring conservation zone, or do you want to make it a full-blown marine protected area? So that means no recreational fishery, no crabbing, no shrimping. How far do you want to go? So we're going to make it one big area for an important wildlife area. So we're going to preserve everything here, or is this, well, we're going to preserve the things that I don't use? And that's a big discussion. So I think it's important for people to decide, first understand how are people currently using it, because on one level you just see big commercial boats are coming from who knows where to your backyard and leaving. And yet for some here, people still want to benefit from the marine resources that are there. You're just taking it on a different level, but maybe when you add it all up, you two are collectively one big commercial boat.
We've got some speakers. I've got to acknowledge the speakers.
Jackie's
Oh,
twitching.
okay. Jackie.
Thank you. Sorry, folks, and I am twitching, and I want to make really clear that I'm speaking as an educator and a communicator more than I am as a scientist. So if at some point, and the twitching is because, okay, enough already, action. So if you have decided, and I suspect because there was a herring fest and a herring ball and everything else that you have decided that the fisheries modeling is not precautionary, that it does not take into account the changing predators for the herring and changing ocean conditions, and that you have had 2 leaders in the recovery of killer whales say to you that in looking at the levels of Chinook for endangered and threatened killer whales, that it has not been looked at to look at the herring fishery, I would suggest that if you get to that point, what to do, marine planning, work out the details, get people involved with that clear messaging, decide what it is, but then don't make this about Hornby and herring versus all the other efforts. What I would suggest to you is to start with the southern resident killer whales. There is a hashtag and a very big motion out there already. So this is me talking as a communicator and a strategist around communications. No fish, no blackfish. Make it clear brochure, put signage on Hornby. You guys are a magnet for people of influence and affluence. Get them, you want to know how to make change? If you don't have First Nations to take the stand for the herring and everything that depends on them, then do it by other people having a clear ask, contact these politicians. Make a push, but tie it in to other protected areas, into other species, and don't just make it about the herring. And the wonderful push, because for me, again, a lot of the beauty today is I loved sitting at the back and hearing you gasp when you saw the blade on the Comox post that used to buck into basking sharks, or that the sea lion haulouts used to be bombed and practiced on before World War II. We aren't that anymore. Here we have a group of people who are fighting for little fish and everything that depends on them. How do you move that forward? It's a change in value systems. How do you get people to change their value systems? An easy hook in is endangered killer whales. Yeah, make clear the connection, help people understand, as Andrew put it poetically, that you are investing in long-term sustainability instead of short-term economic gain. And in that way, I can tell you as well, you are not helping push people into the pit of despair, because now there's another issue. Now it's the herring of Hornby. Yeah, these are the same issues. Connect them on a bigger picture, come up with a clear ask, get signage out there, get a brochure out there, and talk to other groups like everybody else pushing for no fish, no blackfish, and make it a unified force for long-term sustainability instead of short-term economic gain.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much. The gentleman here?
May I make a suggestion? If we want to change our value system, the best way to do that is to change the language we use. We've gotten very used to this term of fisheries management, and I would suggest it's a term that we just push aside and forget about. Humans have never been very good at managing anything in nature. It's utter hubris to think that we ever will be. Mostly what we can do is exercise prudence. So instead of having fisheries management, let's have fisheries prudence.
Very good point. You know, you don't manage fish, you really manage people. I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer, you know, you're calling it fisheries management or grizzly bear management. You go manage grizzly bears? No. But I want to get one word clear. I don't think what we're proposing here is to end the herring fishery. We've said curtail it. We want to see it more sustainable. We don't want to see it go to 90% lost. We want to see it, if it done in a way that is more, what's that word again, precautionary. And I think a gillnet fishery that has a big enough mesh to catch the older fish that lets the younger ones go. And we use that for human consumption, and we let the fish do their biological thing up to it instead of catching the 2 and 3 year olds. There is a sustainable fishery here. I don't think it's with seine boats. And my personal bias is seine boats to me are the same as bombs and mines on the beach. That's my horrible, the way I see seine boats, because they are non-selective. They go, but once that net goes in the water, after that the decision is made. So anyway, I got to talk to Jenny Bach.
I just wanted to ask, another alternative, you sort of mentioned it, is the whole idea, I don't know if any of you guys know why there was no local food fishery this year. VFO didn't allow the local food fishery that supplies the local fish shops. And the alternative, of course, as you're saying, is to turn the roe small scale into a food fishery instead of a roe fishery. So do you guys know why?
Well, there actually is a winter food fishery that goes on. It's 6,000 tons or something.
There was no food fishery this year for the fish shops. You couldn't get fresh herring this year.
DFO is encouraging seines to switch from the roe fishery to the winter food and bait fishery.
Right.
I'm not sure where they're fishing, but I'm quite concerned that fishery may have a bigger impact
If they're
on the
staging to spawn.
mainland,
Yeah.
Definitely.
small mainland resident stocks.
Because it happens in November,
solution
December.
could be
Exactly.
worse than the problem.
Very, very much so. You got to be, the old, be careful what you wish for. So I got a list here. Jenny, thank you. Peter.
I just wanted to add to the mix that, part of the thing is, in this sense, we don't know where we're going, except we know it's going to be roughly 30%.
Thank you. More population than we're used to, than we're facing right now. And locally, Bowser has an 800 house development coming on that's going to have an outfall just south of Flora. And then Kensington Estates in Union Bay, after 23 years, has finally been given approval for 1,200 houses, including a marina development down there. So whatever local pressures the herring are facing now, when these come online, there's going to be that many more people. And the forecast for housing on Vancouver Island, according to Alan Fletcher, who's very well positioned to be informed on this, about 800,000 homes from Malahat north to Cameroon in the next 10 years. That seems almost preposterous, the doubling of our population, but that will all have its impact. So whatever seems sustainable now, under that impact is going to be a different equation. And the precautionary principle is always historical, looking backwards. Well, how it was okay last year, how should it be this year, won't necessarily take those kind of impacts into account. So I think, you know, things are moving fast and they're moving in a negative direction for all of the factors that may, in one way or another, impact the herring in the longer run. So I'm with shutting down as much as possible, the number of jobs involved, the amount of retraining, funds that might be required to get those people in other forms of work. It's a pretty economically easy thing to transition, I feel. And if we address those needs constructively, it'll put us in a place to be prepared for what's going to happen next in terms of the water column that the fish have to live in.
And in terms of thinking about putting in any kind of protections, you know, each year that goes by, it's harder to stop the clock. There's more and more people invested in their properties, their use of it. And there is a government now that seems to be open to want to have put in protections, cares more about the environment than our last government did. And so it's also a question of recognizing the political opportunities. But at the same time, you have to think about how to create your case in a way that resonates. So you're not putting somebody into a position of defending policy, but you're pointing out a reason why that they would support. Hence my suggestion, look at what you've got that is so unique and how it would benefit the future.
Thank you.
Okay, I was just going to say that, and Marianne is aware of this, that this area, encompassing both islands and going up to Cape Lazo and down a little bit south, has been called an ecological and biological significant area, an EBSA, and it's not very big and it doesn't encompass the food sources, but it's built around the herring. You know, it's, as you say, it's a very special area because of what the herring draws, as well as other characteristics like sheltered sandy areas where bivalves can live happily and so on and so forth. But what is true is that the MPAs have a prerequisite, which is that the area be recognized as an EBSA, this ecological and biological significant area. So you're already, we all, Denman and Hornby, have that prerequisite recognition by DFO, you know. And the bad part about the EBSA is that it has no conservation objectives. It was just a thing suspended in the middle of nowhere because nobody intended to do much protection with it. You know, I don't know what was their thought, but it gives a basis. I mean, as part of a campaign, not as the sole basis of a campaign, to say, we already know this, we've known this for a really long time, we need to ensure that this whole process keeps moving forward. And within the donut area, there are other EBSAs, you know, which can, you know, and again, they're tiny, they're small, they're whatever, but they're like seeds to say all through this area, people already know that there are these core significant areas that can be the basis of a larger protected area. That's all.
Good, thank you. So we've had a pretty good discussion. Is this thing still working? Can you hear me back there? No. I think we've had a pretty good discussion on herring. So there's two components to this. First is the herring situation and emphasizing, I think what Jackie said, we should maybe look at how what our strategy is on this and maybe shift it somewhat towards what she's saying. So I think that's something we can take away from here. I think there's pretty clear message we're getting about some form of curtailment or change to the way the humans are managed, not the herring are managed, the way we're managed. So let's move over more to the side of what Marianne was talking about here. Let's talk more about the marine protected area issue and how we do it. I mean, that's the other component. I mean, I think one thing Conservancy Hornby Island said, we have two kind of strategies. We cannot do everything. We've got to be very focused. We're a volunteer organization on a small island. So the herring is one thing, and the other is, which is a shorter term, hopefully, thing we could. The second one is marine protection for the island, and we know it's not going to produce Hornby. It's not going to be Hornby and Denman. That's why we looked to check out what this whole donut hole thing we're talking about. Plan to the north, plan to the south. What is our social political way to get this donut hole with something realistic in it. And I think, Dory, that's what people are starting to talk about. So if anybody's got sort of any more light to shed on that, or wants a question on that, we have Mary Ann's here and the others to answer that. So, sir, I'm not exactly sure what your question was focusing on. Are you?
I'd be happy to tell you the larger issue of becoming a protected area, and I want to focus for a minute. The transition here is that 90% of the herring harvest becomes food pellets for fish farms, and it seems to me, I don't know anything on the upside about the fish farms that are strategically located to do the maximum damage to the wild stock. And I would really like to get the opinion, this is a really fine panel of informed people, I would like to get a reflection of the work of Alexandra Morton and whether or not Hornby could join hands with larger group. It started in Washington State not so long ago. They issued a sunset clause on fish farms down there. There's been First Nations activity, camping out on fish farms, and it seems to me that this is an issue that could be effectively tipped over the edge if we were to join hands with larger groups.
So I'll just look at maybe the first part of your question dealing with the fact that it's 90% being turned into fish meal. And if the goal, so let's say that you make that your campaign, it's so you don't want it to be used for fish farms. And fish farms won't use it at all. Why would they? It's what's happening here is that if the goal was to get fish meal, they'd be catching the fish in the fall. It's full of fat, it's got real nutritional value. The fishery is designed for the role of the fish. The rest of the fish is normally just thrown away. And so here they're trying to make full use of it, but nutritionally it's extremely poor. Fish, they feed in the summertime, they put on their fat, they get nice and fat by the winter time, they live off that, and then they spawn, and at that point there's almost no calories in it. And so it's really not worth the while. Same as bears that feed in the woods on salmon, right? They don't eat the full body, they'll take the brains, they'll take the eggs, the gonads. There's not enough nutrition in the rest of it. So I think if they're using all of the fish, it's probably just trying to be responsible to put it to some use, but they're not, fish farms would just say, well, we don't want it at all then. Because most of the food now for the fish farms, it's vegetable based. They're using soya beans, and there's very little forage fish in the diets currently. They've totally changed the formulas, and people have, I think, a lot of misinformation based on how it used to be. But they've changed their industry. So I don't think that would be a starter in that case.
So I would find out first what is actually the case, because it sounds so ludicrous that if it is actually the case that spawned out herring are being harvested to be used in finfish aquaculture and in pet food, then you can absolutely help the force for the open net pen, against open net pen salmon farms. So somebody somewhere find that out for sure and deliver that, please, to all those people. And it's a strong part of my background. I was involved with the land-based close containment salmon farm with the Numgis First Nation and one of Alex's first directors. So do that. But then again, talking from a communication strategy point, I don't think that's your strongest way to go. Help them, make it multi-pronged. But the stronger way to go is from the orca perspective, from the endangered southern resident perspective, from a communication standpoint, to make that link to the herring. But you want multi-prongs to this, so somebody please find out if this is actually the case, and then get those compelling images of however many seiners are going after the fish. Get the pictures of them, not to vilify the seiners and people trying to make a living, but get the pictures apparently of them driving over the killer whales. Get that sort of thing so that you reduce social license for it. Get that hooked into, if it's legit, into the open net pen salmon farm as yet another piece of what makes that a not sustainable industry. But I would suggest that that's not the most effective way to go in getting Hornby recognized for, yeah, I think it's the killer whales.
If I could add one other thing onto that. So I agree with Jackie that from a communications point of view, a link to southern resident killer whales gives you headlines. But I want you to recognize that the devil's in the details. And so while we tell a very simple story that they need more Chinook, well, the biology of Chinook is complicated. There's over 900 stocks of Chinook in British Columbia. Some of them have a life history where they spend their entire life inside waters, others go offshore, some different combinations. There's no such thing as an average Chinook. There's about 600,000 fish are estimated that come through the Juan de Fuca Strait for 76 whales. And they come through at different times. Some of the runs are doing better than others. And so we look at the fish that are here, and plus the killer whales aren't just eating any Chinook. They want the age 4s and 5s. They want the really big ones. And so it's more complicated than just saying, we're going to make more Chinook here, and that's going to save the southern resident killer whales. So just want to throw that out there, that you hear a simple story, and you may want to tell it simple, but the facts may come back. And then you got to figure out, so yeah, how does it really work?
Thank you. Hold on just one second. I just want to say, we've actually looked into this issue about what are the carcasses used for, and we heard what we've done, and I think this is one of the first things we have to look at to get some, however we find that out. And it's used for pet food and for fish farm food. We know it's rendered down into something. It's not thrown away. The carcasses are not thrown away. So the question is what? And there's a plant in Richmond that we're going to try to, that we're taking away from here for sure. The other thing we're taking away for sure is to look, and we already had our, I think our article in last first edition was about the orca and the link directly to herring. And because there's nothing more iconic to the image of British Columbia, coastal British Columbia, than the orca, than the killer whale. And secondly, it's got to be salmon. So there's two links there. On that whole political, social media campaign is right there. But I've still got this speakers list here, and this woman over here has been very patient. Thank you very much.
Okay, first off, fisheries is money. Fisheries is people's.
Yeah, you need it. Okay, hold on a second, we'll get you, Mike.
Okay. Well, with the fisheries, I like fish. We like to eat it. There's the income from the fishermen. There's the salmon farm income. What's the difference between the cost of running boats and pulling fish out of the ocean, which we all know isn't the best way to, like it, there's a lot of off-catch, stuff that gets thrown away and the detriment to the oceans. And the fish farms, which we all know are not the best thing for the wild fish, to land-based fisheries. What would be the difference in the cost and economic value if we just moved fisheries to farms on land and left the oceans alone?
I can attempt.
Because I don't think
So yeah, this is going back to the experience with the Kutera project, the Numgees land-based closed containment salmon farm in Port McNeill. It's difficult because there's a reason that they are in open ocean. That is the equipment, the logistics, everything else, and it's very, very difficult to argue economics because you're using the ocean for a lot of the job that equipment would have to do. So what you are arguing, again, surprise, it's the same. It's short-term versus long-term economies. So there's a way bigger initial capital investment, but you can control all the conditions. We used to say it's like a Club Med for salmon when you're talking about salmon. The product's desirable. I don't feel that my expertise can go beyond that. I can certainly link you to the people who could speak very specifically about it, but also it's really important to realize that this is initial technology. So recirculating aquaculture systems are not new. I don't know if everybody realized that. Closed containment is how the fish start that go to the open net pen salmon farms for starters. And then there are all kinds of species globally that are being raised on land, and they're being done in extreme environments, including the Gobi Desert and the high Arctic. So it's not new technology, it's a matter of how much initial outlay do you wish to have. So again, looking at sustainability in the long term versus economic gain in the short term. There's advantages, of course, by you can get grant money and whatnot because it's a sustainable developing technology, and the list goes on and on. But I can link you to the people that have the expertise, but it's a complicated question because how do you commodify some of the things that the ocean is delivering? And so where are you drawing your economic circle with open net pen salmon farming, both geographically and temporally? Well, yeah, so it's the same feed, and this was the most interesting thing that I had to deal with in a communication standpoint, because there's purists who would say, well, that farm's bad too, because you've got a carnivorous fish. And sorry, I'm going to try to make this a short answer. It's a carnivorous fish, and you're not choosing for the most sustainable feed. But and I guess it's still we, would have crippled ourselves economically where we couldn't have proved the case for the farms. So the intent of that farm, and it was really powerful to watch the Numgeese make the decision, is instead of coho, which has cultural significance clearly to the Numgeese, they chose for what they perceive to be the leper fish, because when it's in an open net pen salmon farm, it's not a fish that they have a cultural connection to. And they chose it because on top of all the efforts to try to push the farms out of the ocean, they wanted to try to help pool by showing that there was a different way.
Energy is a big concern too, because the way you make it economically viable by going on land is intensification, and you talked about recirculating systems, so it's not just the initial capital investment, it's that energy. There's high energy.
So Numgeese Farm has geothermal energy.
Exactly.
It's got, and the open net pen farms increasingly have to use generators because of warming waters and that they can't get enough oxygen to the fish. And there's some really old data looking at the life cycle analysis where they've looked at a land-based salmon farm where they actually had to pump the water uphill compared to open net pen salmon farms. So there's a lot of alternatives, but of course energy has to be a consideration too. But the same thing as the feed, you have to allow the technology to evolve, is what I'm suggesting to you. Yeah, to move in the right direction, not demand perfection from an alternative technology.
Thank you. There were a couple of other people had their hands up earlier. So yeah, Cass on the list. Judith, you had your hand up a while. Please. This lady, who's the woman here? Yeah. Okay. Judith, and then that lady there. Yeah. And then the woman holding the post up.
I've heard a lot of talk by a lot of white men, mostly, today, about what we are going to do to the oceans and to the fish and to the animals and to the whales. The humans, it seems, some humans, think they have the option to plan for the universe, for Mother Earth, for our environment, and I find that distasteful, and I resent it. I don't consider myself to be one of those people. I hope I'm not. What would be wrong with letting the killer whales and the sea lions and the herring have a bit of space? We haven't even talked about plastic and what plastic's going to do to the ocean within a very short time. We, humans, won't have the option of deciding what's going to be done, because it will have been done for us, and of course by us. So I would just suggest that maybe it wouldn't be bad to say, okay, here's an area where we're not going to do anything. We humans are going to leave it alone and let the creatures who live there and who have lived there, who are obviously doing well in that area, let them have it, and we should just back off.
Thanks, Judith. I think the woman here's next.
Hi, I'm Steph Nathan, and I'm from the Comox Valley. I'm listening to you talk about this specific area, but I look at this entire area that you had on the map, and there are important bird areas. There are this kind of restriction, this kind of restriction, this kind of conservation. And I think we should look at all the conservations that are there and see if we can't put them all into a protected area instead of having all these isolated little important bird areas, important this area, important that area, and just save the whole area. I mean, we already have so many covenants on it. Why don't we just combine them?
Yeah, well, actually, the maps are showing where the creatures are. It's not really protected areas on the maps. It's just where they're located. But I mean, there's a lot of support for the notion that you're talking about and Judith's talking about. Of course, I don't want to be the one who proposes we close Nass Banks to sports fishermen because I won't make it down the dock the next time. But anyway, there's some issues with this. Now, Kath, I think you are next, and then the lady holding the post up.
Okay, I don't want to belabor the point, but just back to Jackie's comment, which is a good one, that we have to fact check the claim that the bodies of the carcasses of the roe fishery are used for fish food. Is that there was an article in the province in March 12th, 2017 that says Barry McMillan, the president of the J.S. McMillan Fisheries, says even though they hardly make any money on the roe, the fishery helps to maintain the infrastructure of the industry, including its processing facilities. So that's kind of a make-work project, you would think. And then another quote from that article is Rob Morley, vice president of Canada Fisco, says the herring are frozen upon landing and later thawed out gradually for processing. The flesh and oil are rendered for feed for livestock and farm fish. So that's where we got the information from. I don't know if the province is reliable or not.
Could that be perceived as bycatch, that they're doing a good thing with the animals that are caught?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would watch that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I'm wondering, what do we know about the counter arguments and the opposition, whether we're talking about herring or protected area or Chinook? There's probably more than one, but what do we know about them, and how important is it to understand what the counter arguments are?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question, and it's, you know, it's the old thing almost like follow the money. You know, Jimmy Pattison owns Canadian Fish Company. It's one of his 20 or 30 companies he has. And the Canadian Fish Company, CanFisco, owns half the seine boats out here. And so Canadian Fish gets those fish, and it goes into its plant. It's divided into the roe that goes to Asia, and then the carcasses are rendered into as Kath pointed out there. So the interest in that financially is obviously there. What the fishermen here get out of it, I mean, there might have been a much better economic argument years ago when these things were worth $5,000 a ton. Now they're worth $700 a ton. Well, you know, when you try to figure out biological or ecological or ecosystem-based value on something versus a pure economic value on it, my brain doesn't see the economic value of taking these herring, because the fishermen, the gill netters worked about 5 days this year, and these seiners will be lucky if they work 4 or 5 days. There's 5 people on a seine boat. There's 3 people in a herring skiff. Now you add up the number of days that is of actual labor. It's not a whole lot. So the benefit there is not great. So the other economic benefit is what are the companies making? And how many jobs is it creating in the companies? And I don't think you look through there, the rendering of these carcasses and how that is. The roe is stripped out of the female herring in a machine, and the carcasses, which contains the milt, don't forget. I think there's some Andrew, I'm going a little against what you're saying there, because I think there is some food value in that milt, because the milt is still in the males. That hasn't gone anywhere, because they want the females before they've spawned, obviously, and none of it makes sense. So that milt must have a pretty high oil value or content. Andrew, would you think? There's something in the milt, is there not? What are these guys doing?
It always comes down to this discussion.
So there you go. I think the point I'm trying to make, if you look at the economic argument on the other side,
Very important.
this rattles around in my brain a lot, because, you know, I fished commercially. My best friend on the island, George Stonehouse, fished his whole life, and we talk about this constantly. And George Stonehouse, who Gillnet for 30 years, worked on seine boats, worked in the Haida Gwaii, and worked in the Central Coast, worked around Hornby, worked right here. He doesn't want to see this thing go on any longer. He says it doesn't make sense anymore, and he's seen all those fish creatures that we've seen collapse over the last 50 years. He's been around here for 50 or 60 years. The lingcod, the rock cod, the dogfish, all these other things, he's seen it all go down. He's seen the spring salmon go down. He's seen the coho leave, you know, and he's seen resident herring stocks behind all these little resident herring stocks all around Hornby. And he talks to guys like Billy Proctor up in the Broughton Archipelago. So he's a wealth of connection to the industry and everything else. When that guy comes to the conclusion, First Nations people always say, listen to the elders. He's an elder. He's been here. He's done this. I listen to Mike Morrell too. You're a bit of an elder over there, Mike. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I take what he says very seriously. So, you know, what time is it here? It's 25 to 4. There were some questions left yet?
Well, so if it's
Okay, a
not
couple more.
economic, what is it? What are we missing? It should be very easy to push is it legacy thinking about, is it
It's short-term economic
institutional,
gains or something.
largesse?
You know, I think,
What are we missing that's
you know, that's the question. I think DFO simply does this because it's what they do. Every year they put out a herring management plan. Every year they use the same statistics. Every year they use the same rationale. You know, Mike, I'd really love to think they're thinking differently about this stuff, but I don't see it, you know. When I read those biomass things that come out from them, I don't see 140,000 tons of herring out there when they talk about taking 20% of the biomass. I don't see it. So anyway, let's not belabor this point. It's something we're definitely looking into. We actually thought of hiring some bright young graduates and start snooping through all the literature and the research to try to, because it's a very, very important point. And I think the other thing is what Jackie was talking earlier. I think we want to pursue that media thing. We absolutely agree on the orca, Chinook, herring link is a vital one, and it's a good one for us to pursue. We also understand Hornby Island isn't doing it on its own. We need to make these bigger linkages. If we're going to talk on the marine protection side, we need to reach out, and it's going to be that bigger picture. And I think these are the conclusions we're working with and trying to strategize on to move into the future.
And
So-
just one quick statement to tie together what Andrew and I have said. Be very careful in your communications if you go down that route, not to assert that the herring are important to the Chinook, but rather to throw the question out, right? So don't put yourselves in the position that you have to prove that the herring are important to the Chinook, that the southern residents depend on. Make the question, like they clearly eat herring, now why aren't they being protected? Do you understand the nuance that I'm trying to bring across? Okay.
Make them prove it's.
Make them,
Yeah. So
Yeah,
can I just say
I also think
something?
it's very important to think it through, what it is that you want. You say I want to shut down the roe fishery. Where are the bounds on that? Are there any bounds? But I think you have to have a clear idea of where you want to go. And in terms of back to your question about, you know, where's the opposition, I think you need to put through sort of a strong proposal and find out what the opposition is. So if you say our limits are this around Hornby and Denman, for these reasons, we would like the government to consider this, find out what the response is. But I think you need to know ahead of time what is it you're trying to achieve. But it has to be very concrete, I think.
So there was, yeah, this gentleman here.
He has the mic. Yes, I apologize if I missed this question earlier, but it's a question for Jackie. Last night in your presentation, I believe, if I remember correctly, that the majority of the herring is used for fish farms and pet food. Is that correct? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that earlier. And my question which may have been answered earlier was, is there any way we can change those uses? Discourage those uses?
Yeah, I think that needs to be part of your strategy, is to find out and then work that into the strategy. Yeah, and there is that graph that we all been looking at. Yeah, that puts how much percentage of Chinook diet that DFO study is herring. Yeah. So
Yeah, thanks. Hold on a sec here now. Lori, okay, you're next, but hold on.
Sure.
I gotta keep my list going here. What's your name, please? Yeah.
Where?
We lost Dory.
Oh, it just got handed to me, so I didn't have a sense of where other things were. I'm good to have other people go before me, you know.
What I was going to say was that DFO, you know, has part of their mandate is to promote the fisheries, and the people who, you know, and then the other part is to apparently, you know, protect the species.
conflict of interest.
Yes, so they have an inherent conflict of interest. But one of the things that hasn't happened is that all the interest groups, like the communities are an interest group, First Nations are a nation, beyond even an interest group, you know. They're all, you know, DFO is not even used to listening to or including, and they have very bureaucratic ways of excluding, you know, in their processes, all of the people like us. And, you know, we've been pushed to the side of the road many a time, but it is really asserting your absolute interest and right. Like they see they're managing a resource without any of the local interests as actually having a right to have input, you know, into any of those decisions. And so, you know, some of is like seizing the social license to know what you know and hold on to your place instead of it being kind of, you know, a giant federal organization which makes the decisions for yourself. It's like really taking back all your rights is really what it's all about, you know.
Thanks, Dory. Very true. So I think Mike, and then Sandra, and then Ross.
Grant, I'm not going to talk anymore about herring modeling or management. I just had brief comments on the herring Chinook orca connection and on the disposition of the carcasses. There's an international commodity market for fish meal fed from all different sources. The fish offal from all kinds of fisheries. There are fisheries like the Peruvian Anchoreta fishery that are primarily for fish meal. So as the article that Kath was reading mentioned, the carcasses are reduced to oil a little bit. Andrew made the point they're not oil rich after spawning, and fish meal, which is primarily protein that becomes generic animal food feedstock, and it goes into a market that feeds cattle feedlots, fish feed, salmon farms. But I think it's, I really appreciate that you're going to run down the precise disposition of the fish meal coming from the herring carcasses. That may be a powerful argument. I don't think it's correct to link it tightly to fish farms. That would depend on, you know, what Marine Harvest and these big multinational companies, where they can most cheaply get fish meal today. On the herring Chinook orca connection, don't think food chains, think food web, and note the mentions that both Andrew and John have made about the dynamism of these ecological systems, the flexibility. So I don't doubt the connection between Chinook and orca. The people who study them, John made that case. I'm questioning whether, even if the fishery is having, is driving down the herring stock, and I think the current evidence does not suggest that it has over the last 50 years, The reduction fishery, yes, I think overfishing was part of the picture, but the harvest rate of the roe herring fishery is totally different. Anyway, I don't think that making more herring available to the Chinook is going to make more Chinook available to the orcas in a reliable way. Might. Chinook have a lot of other things going on with them. Their requirements for freshwater are very high, very specific. Their young have to rear for at least a year in freshwater. They need stable, high quality freshwater and steady, predictable flow. So dams, diversions, pollution of freshwater are problematical for them. Also, particularly in the Strait of Georgia, the harvest rate of sport fisheries, not commercial anymore, inside here, outside yes, harvest rate on Chinook is a very big factor, especially in the returning adults. Those are the ones that are sought after. If you want a quick, direct way of making more Chinook available in the Strait of Georgia, you curtail sport fishery. Andrew mentioned that management advocacy organizations and different fisheries gear groups too. Everyone finds it easier to say, yeah, shut those guys down. It's easier to curtail the use by somebody that isn't us than to curtail our own. So that's all I have to say on that.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Sandra, you hand the mic next door there, please. Stay still working.
I'll sit down because I feel kind of nervous. I'd like my interaction to be with a woman from West Coast Environmental Law. I love the idea of protected areas, the management protection areas, and that's in the Ocean Act, and there's also an opportunity for change within the Fisheries Act. There's another sort of the ecological protected areas, I think it's called. It's not very often that the acts get opened up. They're open. It's an opportunity for the public to have an influence. There needs to be regulation that goes with the act so that then there can be compliance and monitoring and consequences to not protecting those areas. I love this area. It's like the Galapagos of the North. I don't think enough Canadians know how unique and how beautiful this area is. And it includes everything, below the water and above the water. And friends and I, we hired a boat and went for a circumnavigation of Hornby Island on Monday, and a bunch of them were biologists, and they were just about jumping out of their skin with the excitement of the beauty and the diversity and the abundance. And so I think it's hard to, capture the imagination of the Canadian public with fish, herring. They don't blink, they don't coo, they don't scream when you kill them.
Oh yeah, they do.
They do. But people don't know that. It's much easier to, the orca whale, that's an iconic species. People love, the look of the fish and birds. People love birds. I think, if we could promote this area as the Galapagos of the North, that we need legislation to protect this area, we need regulation to enforce, the requirements of the act. I think that would be a much easier sell to get the public, the Canadian public, to put pressure on the government for, significant changes to the act.
Thank you very much. The only one problem, I love the idea of Galapagos of the North. The only one problem, if we Hornby Island and say that, Denmark's going to say, no, we are.
No,
and then Muskegee's going to say, no, we are. So anyway.
I would beware, right? Beware NIMBYism, because then you're throwing it into areas like mine from northeastern Vancouver Island, which I can assure you are possibly even more rich, right? But because you have population, the demographic on your side to push it through, then it's at the cost of areas like ours.
Okay, Marianne.
I'm not sure what the question is.
What was the question, Sandra?
What was your question?
So my question for you is, you're working in the area of law and biology. What do you see as the possibility for protection of the Salish Sea, this sort of general area, and north?
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned with Grant's slide as well, this area is a donut hole in terms of planning and protection. There's a lot of focus to the north, and there's a little bit to the south, and there's some across Canada and out to the west of Vancouver Island. So building a case for protection of the Salish Sea and planning of the Salish Sea so that, as was mentioned, you can set aside places that you decide where you're going to have human activity and where that can happen, and then areas that you're going to set aside for protection. And you're right, these acts don't come up for amendment often at all. The Oceans Act is 20 years old and just come up for amendment this year. So building a case and pushing forward on strong protections for marine protected areas within our acts is really important.
Thanks, Marianne. We have two.
Can I add something? So Sandra, rather than the Galapagos Islands, you might want to choose something like the Serengeti. An image of this annual flow of animals that come here to be here at the same time as the herring is seasonally important. So I think you have to choose your right system and not just focus on the biodiversity, because you don't have many finches here or tortoises. But Serengeti I think might work. I know.
But Serengeti, we have used that.
Yeah, and I think it works quite well too. Just want to make one comment about the thought of trying to make a link to the southern resident killer whales again. Because in thinking it through, as you would build this case, we need more Chinook, and we're going to do it by making more herring available to the Chinook. Well, at the end of the day, that would come back to bite you, because you have groups that are out there telling me, and there's some models you'll be hearing about probably in the news in the coming months, that the way to get more Chinook is to kill half of the seals. And that's going to come forward. And so if you're out there saying we need to make more Chinook, the simplest way is to remove the other competitors. It'd be a cull. And so you're almost setting us up. When you said you want more Chinook, didn't you? You said, yes, but we only meant to make it through. So that's some of the things that are coming down. We're doing work right now. I've got one of my students looking at blue herons. They eat huge numbers of Chinook. Little tiny ones, huge. We're finding now into the thousands of fish tags. No one ever suspected that before. And so we're almost opening this can of worms where everyone's going to be on the hit list. And so you want to be sure that if you're going to get behind a campaign, you realize where you might see it all go.
So I just want to say, we focus on herring, so it almost seems like we're herring, but we are really concerned. You saw actually Jackie's presentation and the one I did this morning, both have that same graph in there. 71% of lingcod feed on herring. The cormorants, the rockfish, the dogfish, everything else out there. So it's not just about herring. I mean, the herring, in my mind, the herring, Chinook, orca is a great media play because it's simple. They could see it, they'll play it. It's a great 30-second, what do you call that thing, YouTube hit. Because it's yeah, but if you think about it in a much more holistic and ecosystem-based management sense, it's all these other things, and it's all the things everybody's talking about. We've got to, anyway, I don't want to, Ross, we got two more speakers, Ross, and then we have the gentleman in the red shirt, and then I think we're going to cut it off, and if you'll allow me to make a 15-second end, unless anybody on the panel wants to jump in. We'll see how that plays out, and then we'll call it a day until the songbirds tonight. So, Ross, there you go.
Yeah, I just want to make a point that if legislation is going to be changed, then there has to be a political will. And in order for there to be the political will, then there has to be a case built to make that happen. And I think a very case could be made by salmon as a food supply for human beings. And like whatever it takes to do that, whether it's save the herring, creating in protected areas and so on, that just simply it's a fantastic food supply for people. And that hasn't really been talked about much.
No, I mean, some scientist once says he's always hung up between save and savor. Savor because you love to eat it, and save it because you want to keep it, alive. So the gentleman here, please.
I just wanted to see if it could go a bit wider, in that there was a bunch of some acronyms. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but there's a bunch of acronyms that related to ocean and marine protected areas, starting with MPA and then a bunch of others. And I don't know really what they mean, although you certainly expressed the notion that some of them didn't really seem to mean much, like the Canadian National Parks tag. But there's other places in the world that are presumably as rich in diversity and have the conflicts of humans and human activity and biodiversity. And other people, I'm sure, in the world who are working hard to try and protect their areas. Could you talk a bit about what's been done, maybe in other areas, or just something to give us a sense of whether MPAs or something like that is actually doing the job in some other area to give us sort of a place in history for this, and that might be places we could look to for our solutions?
Yeah. So yes, there's several pieces of legislation in Canada which are used to make marine protected areas. And they're run by 3 departments, federal departments, if we're talking about federal protected areas, which are Parks Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and then the Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And different acts are used, different pieces of law are used by each of those departments to create marine protected areas, and each of those laws create marine protected areas with slightly different rules around them. So national marine conservation areas have in the act that there will be no oil and gas exploration within those areas, but that point does not exist within our Oceans Act, which is used by Fisheries and Oceans Canada to designate other marine protected areas. So in some of those protected areas, oil and gas is banned, but it's not a baseline protection across all marine protected areas in Canada. Looking to other examples of law for marine protection, in the state of California in 1999, they enacted the Marine Life Protection Act, which required the state to implement a network of marine protected areas up the coast. And the requirements within the law there ask them to designate a network of marine protected areas based on the best available science. And working from that law, they brought together stakeholders up the coast, divided the coast into 4 separate areas, brought together teams which planned protected areas, and then brought it back to a science advisory committee,